Casey, and it is my honor to be your host of Spirecast today. We all know that ministry is challenging, and trying to stay healthy and resilient as a church leader is even more challenging. That's why we've created Spirecast, and Spire wants to provide resources that equip you to lead from a place of wholeness. We also want to give you the guidance and support to implement the best ideas on ministry resiliency for all the challenges that we leaders face. That's why twice a month we're bringing you an opportunity to hear from a leading expert and give you the chance to ask the question you have so that you can also thrive in ministry. And today we're going to be talking with Dr. Mark Quanstrom about theological integrity and the pastor's heart. Mark is the founder of the Center for Theological Integrity at Northern Seminary. He is a professor at Northern Seminary and lead pastor at College Church of the Nazarene in Illinois. He previously served as dean of the School of Theology and Christian Ministry at Olivet Nazarene University, and he's been pastoring for 36 years. So Spirecast, help me welcome Mark to our conversation today. Hey, Dr. Mark.
Hello, Casey.
Great to meet you, and thank you for taking the time to encourage leaders today. We have a couple questions for you, but for those who are wondering, what do you mean when you talk about theological integrity, and why do you think it impacts the hearts of pastors?
So, theological integrity is a reference to the integration of theology and practice, or biblical teaching and practice. Theological integrity is really not about the character or integrity of the pastor per se. It really is about, are we practicing, are we doing church, practicing out of core convictions, out of biblical truth, out of theological convictions, or are we doing church in ways that are undermining of, subversive of, or sometimes even antithetical to what we say we believe? So theological integrity is a phrase that calls us to think biblically and theologically about how we do church.
How do you see this impacting pastors today?
Well, so I've been a pastor for 36 years, and I happen to be in a denomination. So there are obviously a number of churches. Our polity organizes the church into districts, and we have a district superintendent. So we're a denomination. And the institution of the Church of the Nazarene is interested in growth, as most pastors are interested in growth in their churches. So as a young pastor, my first pastorate was a church of 26 folk. And we would get denominational literature from our denominational headquarters, and we would be encouraged to grow. And then annually, we would be either rewarded or accommodated, rewarded for growth or accommodated for lack of growth. And so I don't think this is simply a denominational issue. I think every pastor carries with them the burden of, advancing the kingdom, being part of a growing church. In the United States of America, growth is kind of the metric. That's what decides whether or not you're a quote unquote successful pastor. And so I think that we as pastors, in an effort to reach the most people, which is a worthy, obviously, a God-granted desire, are tempted to practice or do things as pastoral leaders that are not immoral, but are not necessarily in harmony with what we say we believe. And so if numbers is the metric for a successful pastor, then the question I'm answering is, how do I get the most people in the building?
Right.
And not, am I being faithful to the gospel? And so I think that has, again, I don't think that is parochial. I think every pastor, regardless of their tradition, wrestles with this. But my own personal experience was I began adopting practices from pastors in other theological traditions that did not serve our theological tradition very well. And I found myself frustrated and at uneasy. Let me say it that way, uneasy about how I was doing church because it really wasn't in harmony with what we said we believed. These are very subtle temptations. These aren't obvious temptations, and they are the temptation to measure your worth as a pastor by these kind of metrics. I've heard them called vanity metrics. Never goes away.
Yeah.
When I was pastoring a small church, we had the numbers. We had the attendance board on the wall of the church. And so we would take account and the numbers would go up, or how many did we have here last week over against this week? And I found that the attitude of the worshipers in the building was more determined by the numbers on that board than they were determined by what was going on in the worship service. And so I still tend to measure the success or worth of what we're doing by how many people attend. So theological integrity is really asking pastors to, New Testament folks counted. I mean, we know how many people were baptized on the day of Pentecost for sure. But that can be a temptation away from gospel
Mhm.
to measure how well we're doing by how many people are coming to our services.
That's good. I think there are a lot of leaders who are going to resonate with this idea of theological vision versus maybe a pragmatic vision. What kind of framework do you use to, be focused more on the theological vision? And what's a first step that somebody could take to have greater theological integrity?
Well, what's a first step? I can tell a personal story. So we would get this magazine called Grow from our denominational headquarters, and it would have the latest, the most recent kind of successful pastor who had done something. And I would read that magazine and realize that I could not do that there, or I could not do what that person was doing. And I would second guess my leadership. I would second guess what I was doing at my small church. I mean, how do you commend to a community a church of 26 elderly? I mean, how do you grow a church like that? So I began not looking at that magazine because I found that it was not helpful. I mean, we can always learn from somebody, and I'm not talking about not trying to discover best practices. I'm not talking about being ignorant of effective outreach mechanisms. But my first step was to realize that what the Lord had called me to in my location was unique and different from what the Lord was calling other pastors to. So so the first step would be to kind of realize that while we can learn from others, we probably can't mimic others very well without being unfaithful to our own particular location. So recognizing that the Lord has called us to a particular people at a particular place at a particular time, and recognizing that the Lord wants to work through us in a way that is absolutely unique, and figuring out that we didn't have to be the latest renowned pastor. We just had to be faithful to what the Lord was calling us to. That would be an important first step, I think. Does that make sense? Recognizing that what we're supposed to do might be really, really different from what everybody else is supposed to do.
Definitely makes sense, and it's probably easier said than done, right? You probably have to check yourself regularly on that. Any advice on, getting into that rhythm of making sure that you're staying focused on what God's called you to versus, being focused on what others are doing and how successful they are at it?
Yeah, I think an immersion. Immersion. Let me say it differently. I think a careful study of Jesus' methodology is really liberating.
Yeah.
For example, when you think about the incarnation, when you think about God becoming flesh in the first century for 33 years or so, that's tradition says. God the Father and Jesus the Son and the Spirit were incredibly inefficient in terms of outreach. For example, Jesus spent 30 years in Nazareth before beginning his ministry. He spent 3 years in active ministry. Now, if I'm God thinking about this is the only time in the history of the universe that I would be incarnate, spending 90% of God's life on earth in a small town in Nazareth seems a pretty inefficient way of revealing oneself, if that makes sense, right? But Christ spent 30 years in Nazareth. What's he doing? He's going to school, which is no little thing. He's attending synagogue on the Sabbath. He's taking care of his mother, who was most likely a widow, firstborn Jewish son. He's he's learning a trade. He's doing all of those things that we tend to dismiss as worthy of worthy of religious. I mean, that's not holy work necessarily, right? That's so we start with the person of the Christ, recognizing that it was only 3 years that he spent in active ministry. But then once he gets into active ministry, he spent an inordinate amount of time with persons one at a time.
Right.
And one of the things that I say is there were amphitheaters and coliseums in Jesus' day. They were there in Israel and Judea. He didn't ever fill one of them. He did not have a marketer or a publicist. And when he did attract large crowds, he said things that were pretty alienating. In John's Gospel, chapter 6, large crowds were following Jesus, obviously Jews, and Jesus turns to them and says, "Unless you drink my blood and eat my flesh, you have no part with me." Well, there was probably no more offensive thing Jesus could have said to Jewish people who were forbidden by law to ingest any kind of blood. So watching how Jesus or studying the shepherding manner of our Christ, of our Savior, is very liberating. So Jesus was not interested in crowds. He was not interested in breadth. He was interested in depth. And he spent 3 years with 12 guys, and even that wasn't very effective. I mean, they didn't really understand who he was until resurrection.
Right.
So just recognizing that Jesus did model for us how we were to pastor a people. And he did provide us, I believe he provided us the template. He called himself a shepherd. He didn't call himself a CEO. He didn't call himself a president. He didn't call him, he thought of his role as a shepherd, which was entirely consistent with the call of the Old Testament leaders. So where do you start kind of liberating yourself from measuring your worth by metrics that are not healthy? Perhaps by just taking seriously the model of Christ as pastor/shepherd would be where I would start.
Great advice. I'm also just thinking of the amount of things that distract leaders in ministry today. And you're no stranger to ministry. You've been doing this now for 36 years professionally. Would you say that you see any particular pitfalls or distractions that are keeping pastors right now from staying focused?
Well, there's three directions this pressure for proving our worth by either growing the church or increasing finances or building buildings. We have the pressure from our people who want to be part of an adventure. So our church wants to grow. Our people want to see new folk come into the faith. So we have the pressure from our people. Those of us who are in denominations, we have institutional pressure. Not all pastors live with that. But even non-denoms that are multi-site, there's the kind of institutional pressure there. But then we have our own internal pressure. We have our own pressure to prove our worth. We're really hard pressed to believe that our vindication and justification comes from God and not from what we do. So just recognizing the temptation to justify ourselves by outcomes truly over which we cannot control, outcomes that we have no control over. Now, I'm not saying that our work is indifferent to outcomes, but I am saying that at the end of the day, when others come to Christ, it really is the work of the Spirit. So I find models in other pastors who, for example, have stayed in one church a long time and have just done faithful work. I tend to stay away from celebrity pastors as models, and they're good pastors. I'm not saying anything negative about the celebrity pastor, and I'm very reluctant to criticize any church because the church is the bride of Christ. And I don't think Christ takes kindly to people critiquing his bride. But I try to find models of fidelity among pastors, and I try to stay close to the text, close to the word. What my own personal discipline embraced lately is to spend 45 minutes to an hour in prayer in the sanctuary of my church. Reading, I'm happen to be reading through the Bible this year, but I also read an Old Testament reading and a gospel, and just staying connected to my Lord. Now, an hour a day in prayer in the sanctuary, and that includes speaking and listening and reflecting and considering. So I'm not monologue for an hour. I'm just spending time with the Lord in the sanctuary. I don't have time to do that. I have more work than I have time for. But with that said, I don't have time not to do that because that keeps me oriented. That keeps me remembering. And then being in fellowship with other pastors, being honest about the struggles we face. I think that's helpful. Being connected to other folks who are doing the same kind of work that we're doing. I don't know if that answers your question. But
it does. And, you made me think of, because I know there are different people who are going to be listening to this podcast or watching it. And I know that you're a lead pastor somewhere. And so with that title and position comes probably a little bit more flexibility in how you choose what you're measured by and against. And so is there any advice you would give to somebody who maybe isn't sitting in that lead pastor role, who is going to be responsible for, generating certain metrics within their church, but is also wanting to remain in that theological integrity?
I think a staff pastor position is one of the most difficult positions in the church. I was a staff pastor for a while. I know what it feels like. And one of the counsels I give to my students is make sure that you are working for a pastor who shares your vision.
Good.
I strongly reject a business model for church. I see church as a community of faith. I see church as a covenantal community of faith. And my staff, I am more concerned with their fidelity than with their success, if that makes sense. And now, with that said, I mean, we have grown. We've raised more money this year than last year. I'm not indifferent to those metrics.
Right.
They're just not the first. What advice would I give to a staff person who feels pressure from their senior pastor to evidence these kinds of metrics? That's the question.
Yes.
That's a hard question. Honest conversation with the pastor about expectations. you'd want a pastor that recognizes that not everything is in the staff's control.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, whether or not a staff person can bring more people to the church is probably pretty conditioned on the effectiveness of the senior pastor. I mean, there are criteria that the staff pastor would have no control over. And so I'm aware that the way we do church here is not going to appeal to everyone. I mean, we have a particular culture and we have a particular understanding of what church looks like. And so for me to expect that a youth pastor or a children's pastor could grow the children or grow the youth group apart from the culture of this church is kind of unfair to the staff, I think. Um, and I know of many pastors who have suffered under senior pastors who have expectations like these that are not, I'm going to say this, expectations like these that are indifferent to or separate from the pastor's own contribution to the growth. If the youth group grows here, it is not only the youth pastor's credit, it's to my credit as well, because I've created an environment that the youth pastor can grow a teen group. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So the staff are at the mercy of the senior pastor in these matters. And I think it's unfair for senior pastors to impose metrics on staff that they have no control over controlling. Again, I don't know that that's helpful to the staff pastor who's trying to realize the objectives, but go ahead.
Probably soothing to hear, someone say those things. And I like that you're saying, maybe having a conversation one-on-one about how realistic expectations are would be a good step in the right direction.
Yeah, so we have a college age pastor here at College Church, a student, we're next to a university, right? And we have a fairly liturgical church. It's not Anglican. It's low liturgy. So we read a gospel and an Old Testament and a psalm, and it's, most people would understand it as pretty evangelical. So it's as liturgical as an evangelical church could get. But we receive the sacrament every Sunday. It's just what we believe we should do. For that reason, university students come in and find our worship service a little getting used to. Our worship service is not the seeker-friendly service. So for me to impose some kind of mandated growth on our university student pastor without considering that maybe what we're doing here is not appealing to some university students would be unfair to the university pastor. So our strategy for reaching university students is a relational strategy, because our worship service is kind of an acquired taste for most young people. So you really ought to, you hope you have a senior pastor who recognizes that there's a whole lot of contributing factors to growing a particular segment of the church. And I would lay the responsibility for growing every age demographic in the church to the senior pastor. Is she providing a context within which those metrics might be realized?
That's good. Can you talk a little bit about the dangers you see for a pastor's heart when they're not serving from a place of theological vision that Jesus gave?
Well, so the evidence of the resurrection of Jesus Christ are his people. The evidence of the resurrection, the truth of our faith is the life of God's people. People believe in Jesus because they see the life of Christ in us. So that's one of my core theological convictions. If people come to Christ, it's because we have revealed the Christ to them in some way through evidencing the fruit of the Spirit, through the sacrificial way we're living, through the love that we are expressing, through the grace that we're granting. So the danger to the church in not being faithful to the person of Christ is that the Christ is not believed. I mean, I see this as crucial to the message of the gospel. So filling a room of folk, an aggregation of people who are gathered around an entertainment aesthetic that we call worship, I'm not sure is representative of the Christ. Having folk gathering to worship the Christ who are committed to one another, so this covenantal community of faith, um, I think is a more faithful representative of who Christ is. Christ insisted on knowing people. And as the pastor of a church of several hundred people, and I won't say how many hundred, but I make it I make it a point of knowing as best I can that those who come to this church. It's a lot of work to remember the names of hundreds of people. But I think my obligation as a pastor, as a shepherd, is to know the people that God has called to this place. So the message is not simply a proclamation. The message is a proclamation and fleshed, if that makes sense.
Yes.
The truth of God was Jesus Christ. The truth of God is the people of God, followers of Jesus Christ.
Mm.
And there's liberty there. There's liberty in following after the Christ who has designed a call for us, if that makes sense.
Yes.
So I followed celebrity pastors for a while as a younger pastor. The clothes didn't fit. And the Lord finally got through to me one day. He says, I'm not calling you to be like anybody else. I'm calling you to be who I've called you to be here in this place and at this time.
Mm.
And so that has kept me. That has preserved me. Meeting others' expectations is a tyranny. Meeting God's expectations is liberation.
That's good. I think it'd be safe to say that trust in religious institutions and in religious leaders is at a low point right now. Why do you think that is? And how can pastors make sense of leading in this reality?
Yeah, so yeah, I'm seeing the surveys, right? Um, obviously one of the reasons is the moral failings of pastors. And that's all kinds of moral failings in leadership style, in tyrannical leadership styles, or relational immorality. So that's part of the reason there's not much trust in pastors. But pastors whose identity is not found in Christ, but in the corporate definition of success in the local church, tend to are tempted to be mercenary pastors. The people serve them; they don't serve the people. I heard a pastor refer to congregants as giving units. I mean, that is absolutely contrary to the way Jesus saw people. Your question was, why is there such lack of confidence in the church? And I think it's because we don't serve.
Mm-hmm.
There's all kinds of. I mean, how many leadership seminars can we go to?
Right.
Every pastor wants to be a good leader. Jesus was pretty clear regarding the matter. Gentiles lord it over them. Not so with you. You serve. Now, we follow a Lord in service to his people. And so, yeah, I think if pastors would truly do what Jesus did, is lay down their lives for their churches, give themselves away to their people, reject I'm going to use the word vanity metrics of American evangelicalism. One of the things that I believe is the character of a church is revealed in how we tend to those who cannot do anything for the church. So, do we visit parishioners who are in nursing homes? Do we tend to the shut-ins? Are we tending to the impoverished? Are we paying attention to who the wealthy are over against those who aren't? I think the more the church follows and this may be unfair to corporations, but corporations whose bottom line is profit and not people, the more we follow those kinds of corporations, the more we are deserving of a lack of trust and confidence from folk. It's pretty hard to not appreciate the shepherding care of a pastor who's there when there's the death of a loved one, or who's visiting an Alzheimer's patient in a nursing home. And Jesus was pretty clear about those he thought we ought to be tending to. And so I think a restoration of the church would begin with a re-embracing on the part of pastors their obligation to serve the people, and not pastors who hope that the people serve them. So I have several disciplines that I use to protect myself. One of them is to pray by name for every person in the church. Like I said, we have several hundred folk, which means I divide everyone who attends here into 5 days, and part of my time on the weekday is to pray for 1/5 of my congregation. And sometimes, and what that means is I'm just lifting their name before the Lord.
Yeah.
I also discipline myself to tend to the sick, and I make nursing home visits. Now, I'm a professor at Northern, and I have another podcast, and I'm the pastor of a pretty demanding church. But it is life-giving to me to tend to Alzheimer's patients in nursing homes who will forget that I was there the moment I leave.
Oh.
But Jesus was one-on-one.
Yeah.
Jesus spent time with persons. Granted, he preached to the crowd on the side of the mountain, but his it looks to me his preferred strategy was spending time with persons. My credibility as a preacher the credibility I have as a preacher is found in my pastoring.
Well, this has been refreshing, and I don't think we can ever go wrong being reminded to look at Jesus for all things and see his model for how we do ministry. So thank you, Dr. Mark. And I'm sure there are many people who are going to want to know how to follow you and hear more. You mentioned you have a podcast. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that is and how people can find it?
The podcast is called The Pastor's Table, and I sit with Tara Beth Leach, who's a pastor at a church in the suburbs of Chicago. And The Pastor's Table is simply pastors talking about church, how difficult it is, the challenges, and we talk about the theological convictions which form our practices. So that's The Pastor's Table. And I do have a course on the Seminary Now platform at Northern, which is about pastoring with shepherding as the model. Okay. For $20 a month, you can subscribe to Seminary Now, and there's like 50 different mini courses, and I have a course called I forget the name of it. I forget the name of the course, but in any event, it calls pastors back to pastoring using Christ as the model, pastoring as shepherding. Now, that may preclude us from ever becoming pastors of mega churches, but I think the rewards are much greater.
I agree. Thank you, Dr. Mark. We'll make sure to get the title of all of those different sources. No, that's okay. And we'll put them in the notes wherever this is posted so that people can follow up with that. But thank you again for your time today with us. And we want to thank everybody who's tuning in to watch and listen to this right now. We hope that it is encouraging to you and helping you in your practical day to day ministry that you are in. So we look forward to seeing everybody on our next Spirecast. Again, we want to thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much.